Rock bottom isn't a dramatic cinematic fall. It's actually a slow, quiet sinking. It's the heavy blanket of a Tuesday afternoon that feels exactly like the Sunday before it and the Thursday that'll follow. For me, it was the feeling of being made of lead. Getting out of bed was a monumental task, a negotiation with gravity that I often lost. The world outside my window seemed to be moving in fast forward, just a blur of color and sound, while I was stuck in a silent gray stillness. Hope wasn't a distant star. It was a word in a language I no longer understood. It was a foreign concept, something for other people, for the people who still knew how to smile without faking it. The silence was honestly the worst part. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of meaning in it. The ticking of a clock was a countdown to nothing. The hum of the refrigerator was a reminder of an empty home. My own thoughts were the loudest sound of all, a relentless chorus of self-criticism and despair. I felt profoundly, deeply alone, even when surrounded by others. It was an internal isolation, this feeling that a thick pane of glass separated me from the rest of humanity. I could see them laugh and talk, but I couldn't feel the warmth. I was a ghost at the feast of life, present in body but absent in spirit. Everything felt pointless. Brushing my teeth seemed like an absurd amount of effort for a day I didn't want to participate in. Eating was a chore, not a pleasure. The future was not a landscape of possibilities, but a vast, empty void. I would stare at the ceiling for hours, tracing the cracks in the plaster and seeing them as maps of my own brokenness. This wasn't just sadness, it was a complete shutdown of the system. It was the feeling that the person I used to be had packed his bags and left without leaving a forwarding address, leaving this heavy, hollow shell in his place. People would say things like, "Cheer up," or "just think positive." They meant well, but their words were like trying to put a small bandage on a gaping wound. They didn't understand that the machinery of my mind was broken. There was no switch to flip. There was no lever to pull. It was a state of being, a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. Rock bottom is the terrifying realization that you have nothing left to lose because you feel you have already lost yourself. It's the ground floor of existence, a place where the only view is up, but you've forgotten how to lift your head. In this state of deep despair, I began to disappear. It started with small things. I stopped replying to text messages. A simple "how are you" felt like an impossible question to answer honestly, and a lie just felt too heavy to type. Phone calls would go to voicemail, the cheerful ringing a jarring intrusion into my quiet misery. Soon the messages and calls became less frequent. I was fading from the social map of my friends and family, not out of malice, but because my own internal static was too loud to allow any external signal to get through. I was becoming invisible, one unanswered message at a time. The world outside my front door became a place of immense anxiety. A trip to the supermarket felt like climbing a mountain. The bright lights, the endless choices, the casual chatter of strangers, it all felt overwhelming. I felt as though everyone could see the brokenness in me. I imagined they could see the dark cloud that followed me, that my slow shuffling steps gave me away as someone who didn't belong. So I stayed inside. The four walls of my flat became my entire universe, a self-imposed prison that felt safer than the judgment I imagined was waiting for me outside. This isolation fed the beast of my depression. The less I connected with people, the more alien they seemed. The more I stayed inside, the more frightening the outside world became. It was a vicious cycle, a downward spiral that tightened its grip with each passing day. I lost touch with the person who used to enjoy a walk in the park, who loved the buzz of a busy cafe, who found joy in simple conversations. I was a stranger to myself, and therefore a stranger to everyone else. The connections that once defined me withered away, starved of the interaction needed to keep them alive. The feeling of being forgotten is a unique kind of pain. It confirms the darkest thought your depression tells you, that you don't matter. You start to believe that your absence makes no difference, that the world continues on perfectly fine without you. You feel like a character written out of a story, a footnote in the lives of people you once held dear. This invisibility wasn't just in the eyes of others, it was in my own. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the tired, hollowed-out person staring back. I had faded even to myself, too. My days were structured around failure, or more accurately, the avoidance of it, which in itself felt like a failure. The biggest hurdle was my career, or honestly, the lack of one. Job interviews became stages for my inadequacy. I would sit in sterile office lobbies, my hands slick with sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The questions felt like accusations. Tell me about yourself. How could I? The self I knew was gone. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? I couldn't even see myself getting through the next 5 minutes. Each rejection email was another nail in the coffin of my self-worth. A digital confirmation of what I already believed. I was not good enough. The nights were no better. Sleep offered no escape. Instead, it was a battleground. I would lie awake for hours, my mind a relentless carousel of past mistakes and future fears. Every foolish thing I had ever said, every wrong turn I had ever taken, played on a loop. I replayed failed interviews, cringing at my fumbled answers. I remembered conversations where I felt awkward and out of place. The darkness was not a comfort. It was an echo chamber where my self-doubt grew louder and more menacing with each passing hour, until the sun would rise on another day I was terrified to face. This constant sense of failure bled into every corner of my life. I failed at being a good friend because I was too withdrawn to connect. I failed at taking care of myself because I lacked the energy to cook a proper meal. I failed at being normal because I couldn't shake the profound sadness that clung to me like a second skin. My inner critic was the only voice I could hear clearly, and it was relentlessly cruel. It told me I was lazy, weak, and a burden. It whispered that I deserved this misery, that this was the inevitable outcome for someone so fundamentally flawed. The fear became paralyzing. I became afraid to try anything because trying meant risking another failure. Why apply for another job when I knew I would be rejected? Why reach out to a friend when I was sure I would be a disappointment? This fear kept me stuck, trapped in a cycle of inaction and self-loathing. It was safer to do nothing, to expect nothing, than to face the pain of another setback. Failure wasn't just an event, it had become my identity. It was the story I told myself over and over again until I believed it with every fiber of my being. The turning point was not a lightning strike. It was not a grand epiphany. It was a moment of quiet desperation, a flicker of something that wasn't quite hope, but, a weary refusal to completely surrender. I was sitting by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, feeling the familiar weight of another wasted day. The fear was a physical presence in the room, a cold, heavy shadow. It dictated everything. Don't call your mom, you'll only worry her. Don't look at your emails, you'll only see another rejection. Don't even think about the future. And in that moment, I saw the fear for what it was, a cage. I realized that my life had been shrunk down to the size of my fear. It was a tiny, cramped space, and honestly, I was suffocating in it. I wasn't living, I was just not dying. And a thought, small and fragile, entered my mind. What if I did one thing the fear told me not to do? Not a big thing, not something that required immense courage. Just a tiny act of rebellion. The thought was terrifying, but the alternative, an endless succession of these grey, empty days, was somehow even more terrifying. I had to do something, anything, to prove that I was still here. The idea that came to me was ridiculously small. It was almost laughable. I decided I would walk to the end of my street and back. That was it. My mind immediately supplied a dozen reasons why this was a bad idea. People will see you. You look a mess. You don't have the energy. It's pointless. But for the first time in a long time, another voice, a quieter one, pushed back, just to the end of the street. It's only a few yards. You can do that. It was a negotiation, a battle between the giant of my fear and this tiny, newborn sliver of will. And I did it. I put on my shoes, my hands trembling as I tied the laces. I opened the front door and the fresh, rain-washed air felt like a shock to the system. I walked. My steps were slow and deliberate. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with the few people I passed. But I made it to the end of the street. And then I turned around and walked back. When I closed my front door behind me, I felt a strange new sensation. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't pride. It was a quiet sense of accomplishment. I had done one small thing, and in a life made of nothing, one small thing felt like everything. That first walk was not a cure. The next day, the heavy blanket was still there. The fear was still loud. But now, I had a memory of a small victory. I had proof that I could act, even in a tiny way. So I did it again. I walked to the end of the street and back. The day after, I walked a little further, to the corner shop. It was still a battle. Every step felt like a deliberate act of defiance against the inertia that had held me captive for so long. This tiny, consistent action became the first brick in a new foundation. It was small, yes, but it was real. Inspired by this minuscule success, I decided to add another brick. I bought a cheap notebook and a pen. The goal was simple: write one sentence a day. It didn't have to be profound or poetic. Some days it was just, the weather was grey today. Other days it was, I felt a little less heavy this morning. This act of journaling forced me to observe my own state, to put a name to the formless dread. It was a way of externalizing the chaos in my head, getting it out onto the page where it seemed just a little bit more manageable. The walk was for my body, the journal was for my mind. Slowly, I began to add more bricks. I started reading again, but not big, intimidating novels. I read short articles or a single chapter of a book I loved. I made a rule to message one person back each day, even if it was just a simple, "Thanks for checking in, I appreciate it." Each action was deliberately small, designed to be achievable even on my worst days. I wasn't trying to fix my life all at once. I was just trying to lay one brick perfectly. The goal was not transformation. The goal was consistency. This collection of small habits began to create a structure. My days, which had been empty voids, now had a few small anchor points: a walk, a sentence, a chapter, a message. These actions didn't magically erase the depression, but they gave me something to hold on to. They were evidence that I was capable of positive action. They were building a momentum so subtle, I barely noticed it at first. But a house is not built in a day. It is built brick by brick. I was slowly, painstakingly building a new architecture for my life, one small, manageable habit at a time. The path to recovery is not a straight line. It is a messy, winding road with unexpected dips and frustrating detours. There were days when I woke up and the weight was back, heavier than ever. On those days, even the smallest habit felt impossible. I would miss a walk. My journal would lie unopened. I would retreat back into the silence, and the voice of failure would return with a vengeance. "See," it would whisper, "you can't do it. You're right back where you started." These setbacks were crushing. They felt like proof that all my efforts were for nothing. In the beginning, these bad days would send me spiraling for a week. I saw them as a complete reset, a return to square one. I had an all-or-nothing mindset. If I wasn't getting better every single day, then I was failing. But over time, my perspective began to shift. I started to see that progress wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. A bad day didn't erase all the good days that came before it. Missing one walk didn't undo the 20 walks I had already taken. It was just a stumble, not a fall back to the bottom of the cliff. The key was learning to be kind to myself, which was perhaps the hardest habit of all to build. On a bad day, instead of berating myself, I learned to practice a kind of gentle acceptance. Okay, I would tell myself, today is a hard day. The goal for today is just to get through it. Maybe I couldn't go for a walk, but perhaps I could sit by the window for 5 minutes. Maybe I couldn't write a sentence, but I could make myself a cup of tea. It was about lowering the bar, meeting myself where I was, and not punishing myself for being human. This process was slow and frustrating. Growth is not a smooth upward curve. It's more like a chaotic scribble, full of loops and backward steps, but with a general upward trend. There were moments of joy followed by days of despair. There were weeks of momentum followed by a sudden, inexplicable halt. But each time I stumbled and managed to get back up, even if it took a few days, I was building resilience. I was learning that setbacks are not the end of the story. They are just part of the messy, difficult, and beautiful art of moving forward. There wasn't one single moment when I realized I was better. It was more like the slow, almost imperceptible brightening of the sky before dawn. One day, I was on one of my walks, which had now become longer, more enjoyable explorations of my neighborhood, and I noticed the color of the flowers in someone's garden. I mean, I really noticed them. The vibrant purple, the delicate yellow, and I realized it had been a long, long time since I had noticed something beautiful just for the sake of it. It was a small moment, but it felt profound. The gray filter over my world was starting to lift. Another day, I found myself laughing at something a friend said in a message, a genuine, unforced laugh. I replied with a joke of my own. The conversation flowed easily, naturally. The thick pane of glass that had separated me from others was becoming thinner, more permeable. I started initiating contact, suggesting a coffee or a walk. The fear of being a burden was being replaced by a tentative desire for connection. I was rejoining the world, not as the old me, but as this new person who had been forged in the darkness and was learning to appreciate the light. The biggest change was internal. The relentless, cruel voice of my inner critic hadn't vanished entirely, but it was quieter now. And there was another voice, one I had built myself, brick by brick. It was a voice of quiet encouragement. It acknowledged the effort it took to get out of bed. It celebrated the small victory of finishing a task. It forgave me on the days when I struggled. I was starting to feel a sense of pride, not in some grand achievement, but in the simple, daily act of showing up for my own life. I had walked through hell, and I was still walking. Rock bottom was the end of the life I knew, but it was also the beginning of a new one. It stripped me down to nothing, forcing me to rebuild myself from the ground up, with intention and care. If you are there now, in that quiet, desperate place, know that you are not alone. And know that you don't need a miracle. You just need one small step. Today, just do one thing. Put on your shoes, write one sentence, drink a glass of water. It doesn't matter how small. Just take one action. Because transformation doesn't begin with a leap of faith. It begins with a single, humble step.